Hello, my name is Rinon, and today I want to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about for a little while. Ever since the initial launch of Final Fantasy XIV, damage over time abilities have been a part of the damaging kits of a large number of jobs, enemies, and bosses. The archetype of trading off a larger initial hit for higher dividends across the length of the dot duration has always offered a decent level of depth and player expression, but over the past few years we've seen it slowly but surely disappearing from the game. Today, I want to talk about that. How did dots used to be? How did it change over time, and why is this happening? And of course, why do I think Square Enix should consider keeping dots or potentially delving a little deeper into them once more? Let's get into it. As things stand right now, very few jobs have any kind of real active dot representation. In the case of all of the healers, you have a very instant GCD dot that lasts for 30 seconds that you basically just refresh without too much thought forever amongst your rotation. And giving Bard as another example, you have two dots that are on the same 45-second timer, with an extra skill for refreshing both of them at once. There are one or two additional abilities across the other jobs that are technically dots in terms of the fact that they do damage over time, but most of them nowadays also have cooldowns linked to them that are longer than the dot duration, so there is no kind of thought in refreshing them. You just press them, forget them, and move on with your day. I'm talking about skills here like Bowshock and Circle of Scorn on Gunbreaker and Paladin. There is one additional dot type to mention here, which is one that is almost entirely removed from the PvE experience at this point, but you can still kind of see it with Summoner's Slipstream. These are ground-placed dots that tick while the enemy is standing inside them. Right now, almost every job has at most one dot, but on average, aside from the jobs I talked about a little earlier, those dots are not really something that you manage, but rather something that you passively press as a part of your rotation, and then they just happen, right? Like I mentioned a little bit ago, they are now mostly press and forget, rather than a thing that you aspire to keep good uptime on. You may be thinking, good, dots are boring anyway. And really, I don't blame you too much for thinking that way, but I feel very differently about them. Something that's really important to me in Final Fantasy XIV is skill expression in the jobs that I play. Because jobs have become a lot simpler over the last few years, that skill expression has obviously diminished quite a lot. Roles as a whole have homogenized a bit, burst windows across the board have homogenized a massive amount into the 2-minute meta, and while I don't feel like those things are particularly bad, in fact I'm actually kind of happy that the game is more inclusive and welcoming for players to learn easily, and that raiding on the whole is a thing that is easier to get into than ever before, I do feel like for those players that want to go further, skill expression is not there as much as it was before, and they don't have as much to explore and think about if they want to. As a healer main, dots are a big part of that for me. You might refresh a dot early to snapshot their enhanced damage under raid buffs or your potion window. You might need to pay attention for the timing at which an enemy leaves the arena and account for that in deciding whether to put up another dot or not. Things like that are cool and interesting to me, but it used to be so much more. Let's take a look back at the way that dots used to play in Final Fantasy XIV to get a bit more of an idea of what I'm trying to talk about. A couple of examples to talk about here are the Heavensward era White Mage and Scholar, and the Stormblood era Scholar. White Mage in Heavensward has 3 different dots, Arrow 3, Arrow 2, and Arrow, and all of them exist in tandem together, they are not upgrades. Each of them has a different duration. Arrow 3 lasts for 24 seconds and has a cast bar. Arrow 2 lasts for 12 seconds and also has a cast bar, whilst Arrow lasts for 18 seconds and is an instant cast. Even a change as simple as this provides really interesting thought processes for the player. Because the dots have independent durations, you are not always going to apply them one after another, meaning that your rotation is way less stagnant than it is before. You need to check more regularly when your dots need refreshing, which ones have a cast bar and which ones are instant, and the Act of Stone, or in the current case of level 90 White Mage, Glare, as a filler skill becomes less of pressing 11111 for 30 seconds in a row, and more that you will use a small handful of filler skills in between managing your dot refreshes, which is way more active. You can also factor in the fact that certain dots may be weaker or stronger than others, so in a scenario where two are dropping off at the same time, you need to prioritise which one is reapplied first. Some dots are even potentially not a DPS gain over pure stone usage in certain scenarios, so they become a skill instead that you use as a movement tool. Now let's take a look at Scholar, who had access to Bio 2, which was a casted dot which lasted for 30 seconds. Miasma, which was another casted dot, but this time with a duration of 24 seconds. Bio was the arrow equivalent for Scholar with an 18-second instacast dot, but you could also cross-class arrow directly from White Mage 2, giving you access to that additional dot. Miasma 2 existed as an AoE dot, and lastly, you had Shadow Flare, a 30-second dot that you could aim and cast on the ground, causing damage over time to all of those inside it for its duration. On top of having this massive plethora of non-filler skills to manage, with a bunch of different timers between them, you also had to manage the placement of your Shadow Flare smartly to make sure it gets value for that full duration. Now let's go forward a few years and look at Stormblood Scholar, who at this point has had some of their dot management already reduced and changed, but there is one tool in particular that I want to talk about in more detail, because it's the perfect example of what I believe to be a skill that makes jobs feel rewarding and interesting to play. So I mentioned before that Miasma 2 is an AoE skill, and it is still in Stormblood, just like it was in Heavensward, with a short 12-second duration. It has a high mana cost, which is equal roughly to that of a Succor, but what makes it unique is that it is a DPS gain in single target scenarios. You have to be within melee range to use it, and it is an instant cast. This opens up so many different avenues for you as a player. There was a risk-reward aspect, because using the skill would increase your damage and make the boss die faster, which is good, but at the cost of giving you less of a mana safety net in case of emergencies. Say for example a player dies, you may not have quite as much MP to do a res and an easy recovery. Because it was an instant cast, you could also use it as a movement tool too, which was especially valuable in a time where you didn't get half-casted filler GCDs like you do now on healers. And in order to use it, you had to ensure that you had good positioning on the boss because it only hit in melee range. Whilst these things on their own are pretty small individually, having so many small thoughts to consider for one single ability is a far cry from the simple press it when it's up button that makes up almost all of every job's damaging toolkit now. Having all these small things to consider before you use a skill. Can I use this skill here? Is this going to cost me or my group later? Is there a time that might be slightly better to use this in a few seconds? Yes or no? There are a lot of different things to consider while using Miasma 2 in Stormblood that you just don't have to consider while using abilities now. So when we compare the two, and if you think back to previous iterations of most jobs with damage over time components, I think it's pretty fair to say that there has been a concerted effort by Square Enix's job design team to lessen the impact that dots have in job design. The number of dots have been reduced on the whole, and on those jobs like Bard that haven't flat out lost their dots, the impact they have on overall gameplay has been lowered drastically. There could be a few reasons for this. Firstly, and what I think is probably least likely, are concerns of the debuff cap in-game being reached. This is something that currently only really rears its head in large-scale duties such as Bozja and Eureka. Somebody fact check this if you want, but off the top of my head, if I remember rightly, enemies have a debuff cap of 60, with 30 of those being visible on the boss. If each player is putting 3, 4 or even more debuffs onto the enemy via their dots, it can be really easy to reach a point, even in 24-man content, where you are overcapping on debuffs and players just can't apply their damaging abilities anymore, which is awful. The other potential reason is minimizing complexity. Ease of learning and comfortability of play is clearly a huge factor in FF14 job design right now. The focus on the 2-minute window, the reduction of buttons across the board, and the current design of jobs like Summoner after its recent rework are pretty indicative of how Square Enix wants jobs in the game to be. They want them to be easy to play. They want them to have a very strong job identity that shines through. They want them to have flashy animations, and due to this simplicity, they want them to be fairly easy to balance too. Dots with weird timers or tons of management or constant floor placements can be finicky, or it can be tricky to figure out their optimal usage, or even in the current landscape where fights are extremely complex mechanically, they may feel that it's unreasonably difficult to expect players to juggle and manage while doing those mechanics. To an extent, I can agree with this. I'm perfectly happy for jobs in Final Fantasy XIV to focus on being fun, with strong job identity over being needlessly complex, and honestly I'm glad that more and more players are able to connect with hard content because jobs are easier to play, they can get their foot in the door way more easily. I feel that it should be relatively easy for players to learn their opener and rotation and to understand the logic behind it, and right now for most jobs that's true, it is. You should be able to play your jobs at 90 to 95% efficiency just by doing the core rotation correctly, stockpiling on bursts, and so on. However, I really feel right now that a number of jobs lack something interesting to keep more advanced players invested for that last 5 to 10%. There is space for interesting dot dynamics, or a bit more risk-reward gameplay styles like the Miasma 2 one that I discussed a little bit earlier. These are things that I would really love to see reintroduced into the game a little more come Dawntrail's release. Especially because I'm a healer main, I play healers, and right now their damaging kits on the whole are monotonous at best and depressing at worst. So what do you think? Do you think that reintroducing a couple of the dot styles of old could be what some jobs need to kick some life back into them? You think I'm on cope, and the days I'm reminiscing on should stay firmly in the past? Do you have any ideas for spicing up rotations and job design a little in 7.0? Let me know in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching, friends. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.